Well, let's talk about a day in the life of Jesus and some lessons to learn from a day in the life of Jesus. The reading from Mark's Gospel gives us a glimpse into one of those days, and I wonder what we would learn if people followed you and me around for about 24 hours. What would they learn about what we think is really important? What would they learn about who we think matters? What would they learn about God and love and truth? We see that Jesus seemed to be, judging from this passage from Mark's Gospel, constantly running into people who were struggling with some kind of powerful burden. While he was teaching at a Capernaum synagogue, you recall from last week's reading from the Gospel, he encounters this fellow who has a mental disorder. Now, we read unclean spirit or demonic spirit, but we would say the man was touched. He had a mental disability. He had a mental illness. And Jesus performs an exorcism. Now, he comes there to do his teaching, but he's got his Sunday school lesson prepared, and he comes there to be a Sunday school teacher, but he's got to deal with the guy and the mental disorder. The man's delivered from his condition. All right, so Jesus goes home with Simon and Andrew and shows up at Simon's house, gets there and finds out there's trouble in that house. Simon's mother-in-law is bedfast with a fever. Well, Mark tells us Jesus lifted her up. And there's a note for you. How many folks do you lift up in your day? Jesus lifted her up. At sunset, I think that's probably because that's when the Sabbath would have ended and people would have started moving around a bit. Folks started showing up at Simon's house, and they hadn't been invited. They came not bringing food for the reception. They came bringing their troubles. They came bringing their problems. They came bringing their sick relatives, including some people who usually you didn't see brought out because they had mental illness. They had demons. They had struggles to deal with. And you know how it is, we have family members that we don't bring them out in public very often. We don't bring them to meet new people. But here these people show up at Simon's house. And Jesus, who is supposed to be at Simon's house, chilling, resting, goes into healing mode. All part of the day. He performs exorcisms. And when he does so, he does something very interesting. When the demons leave the people, Jesus says, now you need to hush. I know you know who I am, but you can't tell anybody. How often does that happen in your day when you do something that something really is a blessing and you tell, now don't tell anybody I did this. Usually we say, make sure you let everybody know I helped you. Early the next morning, Jesus, before daylight, leaves the house, finds a place for prayer. That's where he is when Simon and the other folks find him with news that everyone is searching for you. In other words, more people with more troubles needing more help. And Jesus does something very strange. He doesn't set up a healing center in Capernaum, take out a storefront, and start a new ministry in Capernaum. He doesn't build a mega church in Capernaum. He doesn't do the Joel Osteen, Eddie Long deal of saying, hey, I got the Salvation Center right here. He says, no. I have business elsewhere. And so he goes throughout the Galilee region, continuing to proclaim the message in synagogues and casting out demons. Notice the two going together. Jesus sees that the teaching and the delivering run hand in hand, that there is not healing without teaching. There is not teaching without healing. The two run hand in hand. And this glimpse into a few hours into the early ministry of Jesus offers some important lessons on how you and I are to live as people of God. Lesson number one, we are here to embody God's grace and truth. We are here to be the living embodiment of God's grace and truth in the world. Jesus embodied God's unconditional love. We call that grace. And he embodied God's truth. He was God's man of grace and truth wherever he went, whenever he went, whatever he did. He wasn't defined by a title. He didn't need to have reverend or elder or disciple or apostle or bishop or evangelist or missionary in front of his name. He was just Jesus walking around as the embodiment of God's grace and truth. You understand, when you know who you are, you don't need anybody to tell you what you're supposed to do. And you don't need anybody to holler about how good you are before you do it. Jesus was driven by a sense of mission, not by a sense of title. And that sense of mission impelled him to teach and to practice grace and truth. The grace and truth we preach ought to be the grace and truth we practice. If we're practicing the free salvation of God, we ought to act like people shouldn't have to be charged for health care. I did say it. I mean, we did say salvation is free, right? We did say God so loved the world that whosoever will. We don't say that God charges us for redemption. We don't have do you have your copay on salvation? How is it that we somehow get stuck on stupid about this, especially those of us who call ourselves followers of Jesus? Because understand that Jesus came teaching and healing. The grace he preached was the grace he practiced. Secondly, grace and truth must meet people where they are and lift them. The people that Jesus encountered and healed were everyday people struggling with real burdens. They were disturbed and sick and weary and poor folk. Government officials didn't help them. Religious leaders didn't help them. But Jesus somehow managed to turn up where these disturbed, sick, weary, and poor people were. He encountered vulnerable people everywhere because he went where vulnerable people were. Notice, when Peter came to find him the next morning and said, hey, everybody's looking for you, Jesus says, I want to go looking for some more people. Jesus didn't need a focus group. He didn't need an opinion poll to tell him people were suffering. He didn't need a poster to tell him that everybody needed access to a healing. He didn't need anybody to show him where the poor people lived and how to treat them. Jesus made suffering people his business. He made healing his business. He made overcoming oppression his business. And suffering people made their way to Jesus. Perhaps one reason why, because suffering is personal. And people who are afflicted by suffering have a personal sense of where and who people are who take a personal interest in their condition. Grace and truth is always local because suffering and oppression are always local. Jesus shows us that God wants us to show up in those personal and local suffering situations alongside the sufferers. One reason religion is getting a black eye nowadays is because people who claim to be religious and the people who claim to be their leaders in religion seem to be more interested in profiting from struggling people than from liberating them. Mitt Romney now says he really didn't mean what he said last week about not being concerned about poor people. And Newt Gingrich and other politicians have attacked Romney for making the statement as if they're more concerned about poor people than he is. But let's be honest. How many politicians have you seen trying to help poor people? When was the last time you heard of a politician say, my campaign is to lift up poor people? Most of the politicians act like Mitt Romney talked. He just said it. Avarice is now seen as an attribute. Judging from how politicians and other people court the wealthy and the affluent and the powerful while avoiding and causing more pain for the poor, we really shouldn't criticize Mitt Romney for being a Mormon. His faith is his business. But we ought to criticize Romney and other politicians for worshiping mammon. It is not Mormonism, it's mammonism. That's the real problem. I know it's not a word. But you understand I'm licensed in 2 careers to make up words. Grace and truth, thirdly, always clash with the status quo. When Jesus taught and when he performed exorcisms and other acts of healing, he was confronting and overcoming powerful forces that were holding people hostage. Jesus did not come in the name of God to accept things as they were. He came to turn things around. He didn't shrug and say, not my problem, when confronted with oppression or vulnerability. And he didn't side with the established powers. He didn't side with the folks who weren't treating the folks who couldn't pay. He sided with the folks who didn't have any healing and didn't have any money. He didn't side with the people who were the big shots in religion. He decided with the folks who were shut out of religion. Jesus encountered vulnerable people and delivered or freed, saved them. That's what we say, saved them, right? You understand, we've got this notion of salvation all messed up. We think salvation is something that happens so you qualify you for life hereafter. No, Jesus showed us that salvation is what qualifies you to live here. If you're not saved here, you're not going to be saved anymore anywhere else. And the salvation you do not live here is the salvation you will not have anyplace else. The people we do not love here are the people who will be our agents of judgment elsewhere. Jesus didn't seem to be concerned that the religious leaders or the demons didn't like what he was doing. I understand the demons were hollering about it. Religious leaders took issue with him. Understand that Jesus did many of the healing things we read about in this passage on the Sabbath day. In other words, he violated church protocol. He violated church etiquette. He didn't do right. And sometimes salvation doesn't do right. Perhaps we should get a clue from Jesus. God cannot be domesticated by our little rituals. We like to put God in a box and say, God, you show up here and do this way. And God says in Jesus, no, I show up where I please. I do it as I please. And I do it because the grace and truth of God impels me to do it. When Jesus encountered those demonic forces and ran across the religious leaders, He wasn't having accidental encounters. Those were on purpose. That was the way Jesus rode. Last point, grace and truth operates to build God's kingdom, not my kingdom. When Jesus performed exorcisms, he commanded the demons not to disclose his identity. Sometimes people that Jesus healed were told, "Don't tell what I did." Hint, Jesus wasn't trying to be famous. Jesus was trying to be useful. Sometimes fame interferes with usefulness. You notice the more persons become famous, the more they become removed from the people they would like to serve. It's ironic that the more power one gets, the more people have to be around you to keep people who are powerless from getting to you, and from you to them. Jesus wanted to build God's kingdom of love and truth for people. He wasn't trying to build an empire for himself, and so he sought no title. He sought no position. He sought no office, and he refused to allow other people to put him on a pedestal or to block him from people who were suffering. Let's look at this day in the life of Jesus from the perspective of the suffering people, because understand, it's easy to give up hope for deliverance when you've been struggling with a condition that's overwhelming you for a long time. It's tempting to think that God doesn't know about our plight or that God has forgotten about us. That passage we read about in Isaiah 40. My way is hidden from the Lord. It's tempting to think that God has forgotten about us. But the passage from Isaiah and Jesus' ministry declare that God's grace and truth will find us. Grace and truth will not only find us, grace and truth will come alongside us. And grace and truth will come alongside us to lift us. Because of God's grace and truth, weary and sick and poor people and other struggling people can know that we aren't forgotten. And when we are followers of Jesus, we become the embodiment. We become the personal agents. We become the vessels of God for struggling people to be, even as Jesus was, alongside them, with them. Because of God's grace and truth, struggling people can hope for deliverance to come along. And because of God's grace and truth, struggling people can hope somebody will meet them in their pain and join in their struggle and help them overcome it. And because of God's grace and truth, you and I who struggle can hope for a new day and a new life. We can live with hope, not just live with our hurt. And when deliverance comes to us, let's take a lesson from Simon's mother-in-law. You recall what she did? After she was healed, she didn't write a book and go on a book tour. She didn't hold a press conference and go on the latest talk show. She put her healing to work in service. God's grace and truth operate to lift us from oppression so we can become servants. Servants of God's grace and truth on behalf of others, not on behalf of ourselves. Servants who will not hold on to privilege, but will share it. Servants who aren't afraid to take on the status quo, responsible for holding people back. Servants who are willing to be used up for God's glory rather than to have praise heaped on ourselves. Servants who are determined to make hope come alive, and servants who embody God's grace and truth in every breath and heartbeat, because that's why we have every day. This glimpse into the day of Jesus is how God would have you and me live every day as servants, looking for opportunities to be blessings, looking for opportunities to come alongside struggling people, and looking for opportunities to help people overcome the overwhelming struggles and the forces behind them. You and I are called by Jesus to embody God's grace and truth as servants, and suffering people are waiting. They are waiting to see whether the people who say they are followers of Jesus have read what Jesus did every day. Or maybe we are like Clarence Jordan said of his brother's pastor. Clarence Jordan is the person who really inspired the guy who started Habitat for Humanity. Clarence Jordan was a Georgia white guy who had gone to seminary and gotten this notion that when he got out of seminary, Jesus actually meant for him to serve people, not to live in some religious palace somewhere and superintend it. And so he made it his business to take up with folks that didn't look like the kind of folks that respectable white religious folks took up with in Georgia. He was running around helping to find black folks and get them to work. And so he went to preach at a church one time, and the pastor of the church was a young fellow and said he was really concerned about the janitor of the church who had 7 children and was barely getting by. And he said, we don't have enough money in the budget to give him a raise. And Clarence Jordan said, well, I know how you can do it. Why don't you give him your salary? You won't have to change the budget. Coming alongside. Another time, Clarence Jordan was talking to his brother, and his brother says, you got to stop taking up with these black folks, and the Klan is after you, and you got to stop trying to take up with these people. And Clarence said, that's what Jesus would do. And he said, you really are taking this too far. And he said, no, you just aren't taking it far enough. He said, if we did this, we wouldn't have anybody in the church. And Clarence Jordan said, maybe that's what you have, nobody in the church. He said, the problem with you is that you are Jesus admirers when Jesus called on you to be Jesus followers. Amen. My sisters and my brothers, Jesus hadn't called us to admire him. He's got angels in heaven that can do that aplenty, and far better than we. Jesus called you and me to follow him. Follow him into the life of suffering people. Follow him into the struggles they have, and follow him to confront the forces that hold them hostage. And then Jesus tells you and me, this is how I live my day. Why can't you live your days this way? Amen.